Last week, we finished our look, sort of, at Mediterranean societies in the first century, and then the next few centuries following that, second, third, fourth centuries, regarding the idea of strong family, if you remember that, strong family relationships. We talked about the fact that in that society, in the societies of that day, in that region anyway, the families took priority, and there were even aspects of family life to the point that where the sibling relationships actually took priority over pretty much any other aspect of family relationships, including father, mother, wife, husband, and any other kind of family relationship that you might think about. And it was Jesus' mission. He seems to, and I believe this to be true. We look at Scripture, and Jesus, I think, was trying to take that idea of sibling loyalty, the loyalty that siblings, brothers and sisters, had for one another, move that over to the concept of the brothers and sisters in a spiritual relationship, and try to get that idea of loyalty to brothers and sisters in the church to be of primary importance. So where do we go from here? Where does this class go? Where do we take this class? We've looked several passages of Scripture out of the New Testament. We've had a good look at what the church of the New Testament may well have been like in the first century. We've heard the words of Jesus as he talked about being a Jesus follower and how that was even more important than even blood family relationships. And we came away from these discussions, and they were discussions. You all have participated quite well in this class, and I'm glad you have, with these axioms and their corollaries. Number one, in the New Testament world, the group took priority over the individual. Number two, in the New Testament world, a person's most important group was his blood family. And number three, I can't do three this way, so I'm going to do three this way. In the New Testament world, the closest family bond was not marriage or even the bond between parent and child. That closest family bond was the sibling bond. And along with those axioms are these corollaries. Number one, the central value that characterized ancient family relationships was the obligation for absolute loyalty toward one's blood family, and especially one's blood siblings. And then number two, the most treacherous kind of disloyalty was not disloyalty to a spouse necessarily, but rather betrayal of a sibling. And so that's what we found out through not only looking at biblical examples, but also examples in history as well. We also looked at passages, words of Jesus, where we found that his mission was to transfer that sibling bond over to the church family, not to disown one's blood family or not to dissolve one's marriage, nothing like that, but rather to make the relationship between and among his followers the primary relationship in a disciple's life. And that sounds just a little foreign to us in this society, and I understand that. It's a little foreign to me too. We already have an idea that the church family of today really doesn't quite look much like the church of the first century, at least insofar as a church family is concerned and the great importance that the New Testament Christians placed on the church family. And again, understand, I'm talking in generalities here. I'm not pointing any fingers at Riverwalk. I guess I'll just use the old phrase, if the shoe fits, that kind of thing. We have for years, those of us who have a long history in the Restoration Church, heard of reasons why we don't, for example, adhere more closely to what we see the church doing, say in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. We've also been told of the importance of the spousal relationship, and it is important. Our relationship with our families and our children, and those relationships are important. But we don't often hear about the importance of the church family and the fact that the early church apparently treated the church family as being of primary importance, even more so than blood family. We've been indoctrinated in the idea that the church family should be somewhere maybe down the line a little bit on our list of important things in our lives. Maybe number 3 or 4 or 6 or whatever on the list, if it is that you have a list. After God, blood and marriage, family, work, school, maybe soccer practice, vacation, whatever, then maybe put church family down the list someplace. That kind of teaching is not biblical, as we've seen in the 4 weeks of introduction to this class. So if we're concerned about biblical teaching, those of us who long for authentic relationship in the church, those of us who see the church as being less than it could and should be, where do we go from here? By far, the most dominant model of church in modern day Western culture is the business model. The business model. And people like Steve would have a great idea in knowing what that is and what that means. In this culture, one would expect that to be the norm. We see the business model at work everywhere. We incorporate the business model in our daily lives. We deal with the business model in our work, the things that we buy, our banking, our schools, government. The business model of doing things is a core value in this culture. But should the church also exist in the business model? Or do we see some other method of church function in the New Testament? And that's where we're going to start looking at today. We use the word church in several different ways. What are different ways that we use church, that word? Some of them? The building. I'm going to go to the church and mow the yard or whatever. How else do we use that word church? The service itself, yeah. We have church today, be the service. Sunday school also, stay for the class, stay for the whole part of church. What else? Anything else? Well, we sometimes, as was said, refer to church as the building. Many of us in restoration churches add the word building to the word church, but the idea is the same. Have you ever been told, those of us who are a little older, have you ever been told that if you talk about the building, you always talk about the church building? You don't just talk about the church. Sometimes we use the word as an event. I have church tomorrow. We have church on Wednesday evenings. We're going to go do church tomorrow. Nothing wrong with that use of it, just like there's nothing wrong really with using the word necessarily to describe the building. Most of our culture knows what we're talking about when we use the word in those ways. But there's a third sense, however, in which the term is used. The church exists as a business. Think about this. For example, the church is handing out lunches to the homeless. The church helps out at the Lord's Diner. So on. We speak of the church in the same ways we speak about other businesses. The library is having a special children's event today. Olive Garden has a special on their lasagna today. Maybe we need to go to the Olive Garden for lunch. But we use that word many times to describe business aspects of what we do. Of course, we're also moved into the business model by the necessities of the modern day. And I don't begrudge this. These are things we have to do. We're incorporated, Riverwalk is, and other churches I'm sure are too, as nonprofit organizations in the state of Kansas. We have all peril insurance policies to protect the assets of the church. We have bank accounts. We borrow money. We conduct business with plumbers, construction company. We've really conducted business with the plumbers recently. One of these days, we will have the baptistry fixed to where it is not leaking at all. But we've replaced pipes. We've replaced drains. Now, I will tell you, this is a side note. This is free. There is a split in the fiberglass close to the top of the tank in a corner about this long, and water is seeping out of it onto the floor below. So that's the next thing to fix. The last thing I want to do is to have to take that out and put a new tank in. Can you imagine the issue that's going to be? Where was I? Oh, man. All right, let me find it. I write this stuff out so that I hopefully will not commit some kind of a error in what I say. And then I go over it 2 or 3 times. Anyway, we've got bank accounts, we borrow money, we do the plumber thing, construction companies, utilities, our business neighbors. We have a contract with the people to the north of us for parking over here and so on. We've got policies, we have guidelines that we follow in a number of areas. We've established an endowment fund for missions. That's a business type of a thing. The fund itself is. We have a board of trustees for the endowment fund. We have guidelines on disbursement of those funds. We have checks and balances in making decisions regarding the fund. We have checks and balances regarding the writing of checks and paying of bills. We have at least 3 people involved in all of that. But we're talking about more than just these kinds of business functions here. And, a lot of that stuff is of necessity anymore. We have to do that kind of thing. Quickly becoming the norm in churches today is the business model, and it has been for a while, of paid staff and leadership becoming providers, with members and visitors becoming consumers. Think about that for a minute. Church leaders are put under pressure to put on the kind of worship services, sermons, events, programs, and activities that are going to make the consumers want to choose their church over others in the hope that they'll become more and more involved once they join with that particular group. We get the idea that we're in competition with other churches. You ever heard anybody talk about that? I have. Both churches in the same fellowship as well as those of other denominations and creeds. We're in some kind of a competitive world here somehow. We look for just the right things to help us as providers with attracting and keeping our customers. We start various programs, we plan events, we critique the worship service regarding the length of the sermon, number of songs, order of worship, how many prayers to have, along with who's to do these things in the service. We have a sign out front, we make decisions regarding what to put on it. We train greeters, we hand out bulletins, encourage the congregation to be friendly. Our website needs to be user-friendly and easily available. We may have a catchy slogan or some kind of a name for our church, something that might tend to draw visitors. We don't want to seem too old-fashioned, so we drop any words from our name that might betray a denominational affiliation or religious tendency. And again, I'm talking about the church in general, not Riverwalk. Some 15 or so years ago, maybe not quite that long ago, the elders said, no, we're not going to drop Church of Christ from our name. We are going to keep it in there. Amen. And that policy probably will not be reviewed during the time that we are elders. After Dave is dead and gone, somebody may want to review it, but not until then. We look for just the right things to help us as providers with attracting and keeping our customers. These things are all signs and symptoms of a church that operates as a business model. And Steve, I'm going to point to you again, and I'm going to say you probably or may well have, when I went through those, thought, okay, that I can see that in secular business as well.
Certainly see it at the university.
Now I can point to two of you. But you see that. You see it everywhere. Worship becomes an experience. How many of you have heard the term worship experience? Worship becomes an experience rather than a time of meditation, reflection, and dare I use this word, humility before God. Oh, one more thing. Nowhere in the Bible do we see a church that is business oriented. I don't see it anywhere in there. Closest thing we see to that is probably the time, if you remember, when the disciples and the elders met in Jerusalem to determine whether or not the Gentiles needed to be circumcised in order to enter into the church family. That's in Acts chapter 11. Instead, in the scriptures, we see a family. We see a body. We see a temple, if you will, made up of living stones. Of this body, God makes it all fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, this is the church in the New Testament in general. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. The concept of a cohesive body consisting of many parts all working together for the benefit of the body is easy. The implementation of that concept is much more challenging. New Testament church extended far beyond Sunday morning, far beyond Wednesday evening. The first day of the week, as we like to say, was just a small part of what it meant to worship God in the New Testament church in general. I know New Testament churches all had their issues. I understand that. Presenting their bodies as living sacrifices in ways that utilize the talents and the abilities of each one, all fitting together as parts of the human body fit and work together. That is what I believe true worship is, including our coming together for praise and instruction. Comments? Am I going off base here? I'm getting right to the point. That may be a first. I don't know. We'll see.
Jay, I think maybe another instance where the church, at least, I don't know, it is obviously done in businesses, but it's more in organizational principles when they appointed deacons to care for the widows.
I agree.
And some of the things, I mean, it's just a given that with a large group of people like they had, that it would be overwhelming if there were not some processes, policies,
Right.
decisions made to put in place so that they could meet the needs of people. And that's not a bad thing.
No, it's not at all. As a matter of fact, I think in that passage, it talks about the fact that people were grumbling and complaining some because so there were some needs that weren't being met with whatever the currently we're doing. And so the apostles said, look, we need to devote ourselves to the work that we're to do. Let's appoint some people to take care of this other situation. And yeah, that's a good example of organization back in the New Testament church. And there has to be some of that. I don't begrudge. I talked about policies and procedures and insurance and all of that. Those things are necessary. We have to kind of know where we are and where we're all going. When I first started in benevolence, I had no policies, and it was a learning experience for me. And I finally sat down and said, look, I have to have some guidelines, and I developed them and ran them through the elders, and And now I have guidelines for what we do in benevolence. It's made it a lot, not easier necessarily, but how would I say it?
Well planned.
I'm sorry?
Well planned.
Well, yeah, there you go. There you go.
And that's what business is actually. It's a planned activity.
Yeah.
Even families have to have some sort of organization. Some of them do it better than others. But I mean, like you know, we think when you have your kids home and they're in this activity and you have to figure out how to get everybody there. I mean, like
You do.
there's some organization in a family as well.
You
so.
do. You do.
But I-
I'm in the Old Testament reading, and Moses was overwhelmed with all the care of the people.
There's another one.
And then God said, pick competent people to help you.
Right.
And then you take care of the ones that you need to take care of.
Moses was the Supreme Court, so to speak, and he had other
Yeah.
judges, so to speak, that.
So God kind of sent that plan.
Right.
And you've got to organize things, you know, get it all.
Yeah, you do. Did someone back?
Well, I think it's important, though, that that structure be in place for a purpose and to meet a goal or a need, and not become a means or an end to itself. The means and end is that we're supposed to be family, and so we need some organization to function well as a family. We're not in the business of accumulating funds and building up wealth. We're in the business of doing the work that God has provided for us to do.
And there has to be some organization in that. Some people are better at that than others. Some people are better in leadership positions than others. Some people are better followers than others. There are different gifts that have been given to people. And in the church family, the idea is to utilize those gifts. I think the primary thing that is talked about here in what I said is the idea of the preacher and the leaders being providers and the people who come being the consumers. I think we want to get rid of, or try to get rid of if possible, that concept. You know, those of us who sit in the pews, we're really not consumers, or shouldn't be. And the people who are leading, you know, the elders have had this discussion. I don't know if you were on yet, Dave, when we had these discussions, but the elders have for years had this discussion about the worship service, and we need to, and whether or not we need to, I got to be careful with my words because I don't have them written down, and whether or not we need to spice up our worship service with various and sundry things. No bands, we're not going there, but maybe videos, or maybe guest speakers, or maybe whoever, whatever. And that idea quickly gained a little traction, but just as quickly the thought came out, well, if you do that for a little while, then that becomes routine, and then you have to do something even better, and then you have to do something even more, and you have to do something even more and more. And Terry, you're nodding yes. Until where does that end? You know, where does the I guess the hype end with that? It can't be sustained forever. And you want to say something?
Yeah, you know, you're over the 30, 40 years I've seen anyway, that different denominations and what, it's the entertainment, I'll call it the entertainment factor. You know, what can we do? I mean, it may be like the Harley congregation. They say, okay, let's let these guys bring their Harleys down the aisle and park them up on the podium. You know, can we imagine that? I mean, it's whatever it takes to get people in the door. Now, I can understand that, but you know, there's something about, I guess the expression or from Scripture, be still and know that I'm God.
I'm going to give you an example from Riverwalk. and this, I don't mean this in a bad way by any means, but it's just an example. The first time, think back, if you were here the first time Curtis preached a sermon. First time. If you recall, one of the things Curtis did, which is what he a lot of times does, is he sang a verse of a song at the beginning of his sermon. The other thing that he did was he had an invitation at the end of the sermon. We weren't used to either one of those two. And there were several comments about how cool that was. That we had a preacher that led a song at the beginning of his sermon and had an actual invitation. And I'm not putting anybody down. I don't mean to do any of that. I'm not building Curtis up too much anyway. But what do you? But after Curtis has been here for 2 years, is that still a really cool thing, or is that kind of the norm now?
I think it's the norm now. We would be disappointed if it didn't happen.
Right. At first, it was really cool. Oh, he put the bigger podium up there too. That was the cool thing too. And now we would be disappointed if we went back to this thing, and we'd be disappointed. And he did not have an invitation this morning, did he? Did you notice he didn't have an invitation? You noticed that. And I don't know if you were disappointed or not, but you noticed it wasn't there. Okay, it's that kind of a thing. You know, that was just really cool. Well, in a few months, when that becomes the norm, now Curtis is going to have to do something else. And a few months later, he's going to have to do something else. And a few months later, he's going to have to do something else. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with the consumer-provider mentality. Yes, we have to be organized. Yes, there's things that we have to have, guidelines and whatever. You know, we have to do that. But this consumer mentality, someone said entertainment. Terry, did you say the word entertainment? Yeah. That's a different deal altogether. Okay, let's go on. The business-oriented, and that is what the writer of this book and several others talk about in terms of the business-oriented concept of the church. Businesses many times have to put out better and better and better ads and better ads to get people to continue to come to their business to be consumers at that business. You know, and there are some things that you might be disappointed if they weren't there. I don't know if you remember or not, but what's the mattress store? Mattress Hub had the Cheap Sheep, if you recall that. Oh, yeah. They had the Cheap Sheep. There was somebody dressed in the costume. And several years ago, they got rid of the Cheap Sheep in the costume and did an animated one, a cartoon one. That didn't last very long. He got all kinds of criticism. Bring back the Cheap Sheep in the costume. It absolutely didn't last very long. And so now the Cheap Sheep is still there in those commercials.
I still have one of their mattresses I did one time.
Must be good mattresses.
No, get rid of it.
One of the other problems when we get into the consumer mentality, you know, as ourselves, is that we tend to think the customer's always right, and so then we tend to think that it's more about us as individuals as opposed to what the big picture is for the entire church, for the entire congregation. And so it's really, you know, and it's a hard thing to fight against because we live in such a consumeristic society. It's easy to bring that mentality into worship or into our dealings with each other.
It is. I don't know how many of you have heard the comment, well, I just wasn't fed today at the worship service. I just wasn't spiritually fed. There was a woman in Oakley when we were there that was her biggest complaint to the leadership there was that I'm not being fed when I come to church. And I think there's some importance to that, but it was all about There you go. And I'm gonna tell something on a former member, and I'm gonna mention his name, and I'm going to guess he's not going to care. Jim Fly, if you remember him. Jim Fly confided to me one day when he was on staff here that he didn't really care for the kind of worship services that we had here. He was more of a high church, very structured, liturgical kind of person, and that was the kind of worship service he liked. Well, that obviously wasn't the case with Curtis, but Jim continued coming. Jim continued participating. Jim continued being part of the family. Jim understood that he was a part of a church family. Jim never said anything publicly about it. He never went to the elders about it. It was just he and I in a conversation. I can respect that. And I can respect Jim continuing to worship here, even though that may not have been his personal favorite type of worship.
He especially didn't like the meet and greet session.
Right, right,
He had told me, I had heard him say that.
right.
I just tell him it's too bad if you don't like to meet and greet sessions.
Yeah, I wasn't real fond of the meet and greet either, and I'm kind of glad we, at least right now, aren't doing that. But again, that's my personal preference. My personal preference, the needs of the group outweigh my needs.
So he thought it was too casual, is that what you're saying?
Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. So he didn't care for the sandals, or?
I guess not. I don't know. But he was able to be part of the family anyway, and he was able to, to participate and contribute and so on. That's how that works. There may be some of you who are not real fond of this topic. I'm assuming some of them are in this other class, but But yeah, they are. I think they're both good classes, but many of those who are there started out in John and they wanted to continue. And that's one reason we're doing two videos, is because, well, they can't be two places at once. And so, we'll watch the video on one and we'll be live on the other one.
Jay, the concept of what we're talking about extends more than just the worship service. I mean, it's kind of what Linda said. It's not about me and my preferences. It's my ability to be connected to this family of brothers and sisters, and our ideas may be totally different on any number of things, but it's not important that I be right and you be wrong. It's that I accept you where you are, as long as it's not a contradiction of something that God has said is wrong.
And and Linda, that is becoming very prevalent in society today. Because I may not agree with someone regarding my opinion of, pick anything in politics, then I can't be your friend. I think I told some of you in one class before that I had a Facebook friend who is a Church of Christ minister in Texas who unfriended me because I didn't agree with his conservative viewpoints, some of them, on politics. And he's someone I'd known for years. And I was unceremoniously unfriended. I have an app on my computer that I can tell who unfriends me. If you don't have the app, you don't know. You just say, well, I haven't heard from them in a while. Well, this app says this guy's no longer on your friend list. So if you want to unfriend me, that's fine, but I'll know it. If you want to know anything about that app, look up FB Purity. F as in Frank, B as in boy, Purity. Look it up on Google. It's free, and it works. It also does a lot of other things. You can eliminate, and this is a side note, this is free too, okay? You can eliminate posts that have certain words in them. Words like Biden, Trump. You can decide, it eliminates a lot of the ads that come through Facebook. It keeps your timeline in, with the most recent first, and then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. Does a lot of things. You can eliminate pictures of dogs and cats and you can eliminate pictures of food, for Pete's sake, and so on. It has been invaluable to me. It has saved my sanity more than once. He does ask for a contribution from time to time, but you're not obligated to do that. Anyway, back to this. I think you all have got it from the comments that I've received here. I think you've got where we're going with this. We're not saying we need to unincorporate. We're not saying that we need to get rid of the insurance. We're not saying that we need to do that kind of thing. We're not saying we need to get rid of the benevolence guidelines. And, we're not saying any of that. But what we're looking at is the consumer mentality, the entertainment factor, the idea that I need to be fed every week, or the idea that I need to have a little higher level of entertainment every week, that kind of thing. That's what we're looking at. The business-oriented concept, and the bell should be going to ring here pretty soon, business-oriented concept of the church where there are providers and customers, that concept is nowhere close to the concept of the New Testament church as I have outlined. And I'm going to continue on here for just a second. Being a consumer of the church and the worship experience of the church isn't even in the ballpark when it comes to the example of sharing what we have with those in need, meeting from house to house, eating together, both the communion supper as well as the common meal, praying for and with one another, bearing one another's burdens, supporting one another in life and living, and so on down the line. It's not even in the ballpark. I think you're beginning to see that the concept of the church family that you've already been exposed to in this class is one that can be markedly different from what you maybe have always thought or experienced. It requires more than just coming to services once a week. It requires more than putting a few dollars into a collection plate or taking a piece of bread and a sip of wine. The idea of a church family involves changing one's previously held ideas of the church in the face of biblical teaching, modifying daily activities as one is able to do so in order to be an active participant throughout the week in the church family, forming deeper relationships with other members of the church family, accepting into full fellowship anyone God chooses to call and adopt into the family, and to emphasize that word, accept into full fellowship anyone that God chooses to call. The sometimes frustrating work of getting along with other family members, loving them in spite of some of the things that are said and are done. Linda, I love you anyway. Well, never mind. Allowing other family members, members of the body, to exercise their God-given gifts and abilities in the church family environment so the body can grow into the fullness of Christ. Sacrificing time, energy, and resources for the good of the church family. Loving, praying for, supporting, and encouraging other church family members. That's the idea of the church family. That's what the church family we see in the New Testament by and large was and should be. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at the business model of the church, or the business-like church. Some of the characteristics of the business model church, we have some of those, some of them we don't. We'll talk about some of those, and we'll kind of get into that. Any further comments? We got the other bill is going to be another minute and a half or so.
I would add that Jim did not like the meet and greet because he felt like it interrupted the worship atmosphere that we had.
Yeah, he told me that too, and of course that worship atmosphere that he liked was more the, I say liturgical, but more the formal, worship. And that certainly is not formal as a part of the worship service.
Well, God even liked order, and so that's what you're trying to do, is keep order.
Yeah, and there are different opinions on what that means to keep. There's that verse that some people universally dislike, to do things decently and in order. And some people kind of sneer at that, and some people really love that and point to it as a proof text for, well, we can't do this, or we can't do that, or we got to do something else. And it's been used and misused a lot, but there is a reason for having that. And different churches will be different ways. The church that Angela and Pat and I came from in Harper, totally different from what this is. Absolutely different. Do the same things, praying, singing, Bible reading and so on, but in a totally different atmosphere. Okay, thank you. We'll see you next week.